First off, this design for the sled is mostly Stephen Ogle. I didn't incorporate all of his ideas, though I may eventually. I had been meaning to make a segmenting sled for some time, and I finally had a project for which I really needed one, and so here I am. I started by mounting a runner roughly square with the plywood base. It's not actually critical that it be square for this project, but it's nice if it's close. I used to use wood runners, but since trying these HDPE runners, I'm never going back. They just ride so much more smoothly. I cut a couple of scraps of solid wood to put on the front and the back of the plywood base. I cut a rabbet that would accept it, and these pieces provided both a little aesthetic appeal and also sort of a finger catch to both pull and push the sled. Before gluing them on, I just added a slight chamfer with a hand plane. Before raising the saw blade, I made very certain that my hand wasn't in the way. But with it raised, I can cut a slot that will serve as a reference for marking out the segments. The adjustable arm is made from a couple pieces of plywood that I sandwiched together, but I wanted it to have a solid wood face, so I cut a couple pieces of scrap, ensuring that they were just a little bit thicker so they'd stand proud once they were glued on. Once the glue was dried, I could make a few light passes with a hand plane to make the solid wood faces even with the plywood. One of these days I really am going to make a router table for the wing of my table saw, but until then, whenever I need to route a groove, I end up using the panta router. It's overkill, but it works. Rather than try to put a groove in the middle of a board, I decided it would be easier to just route the groove out and then cut the board such that it was centered. With it cut to size, I can mark out a round profile with a compass, and then I'll take it over to the bandsaw, roughly cut it out, and then sand up to the line using the disc sander. Here I'm drilling a pilot hole for where I want the pivot to be for the adjustable arm. This pilot hole is going to allow me to place the T-nut that is going to secure it. So I'll drill out a recess for the base of the T-nut. Before drilling a through hole for the barrel. I like to pre-drill for all the teeth of my T-nuts. And I know that some people like to screw in their T-nuts so that they're removable, but I usually just end up epoxying it in place. If you do end up gluing your T-nuts in, a handy trick is to use a threaded knob on the other side to not only clamp the T-nut while the glue dries, but also to ensure that you can actually thread something through the other side. The first method that I tried to use to find the holes for my segment settings was based on the law of cosines, and I thought it would be more accurate, but it turns out to be complicated and prone to human error. I was really excited for this, the first use of my new segmenting sled, and so I thought I'd give it a try with some scrap wood. To my dismay, I found that using the 8 segment setting, there was a rather large gap, and it turned out to be the same for the 6 segment setting, so I was pretty discouraged at this point. I ended up tearing out the T-nuts that I had installed and then trying another method. The approach that I ended up using, which I originally thought would be less accurate, involved first marking out a line perpendicular to the slot cut in the table, and then tracing out the arc traced by the arm. Knowing the length of the arm and then the signs of all the angles that I need for each of my settings, I know the distance from the perpendicular line to each of the holes on the arc that I need for each setting. I figured that I would try this method first for the 6 segment setting and give that a trial run before I committed to making any more holes in my new table saw sled. And fortunately, they line up perfectly. So with that set, I can go about laying out the remaining settings. I ended up making a 6 segment setting, 8, 10, 12, and 16. The reason that I thought this method would be less accurate is that as you get closer and closer to the edge, the arc becomes closer and closer to parallel with the thing that you're trying to measure, which means that any small errors in your measurement can mean large errors, relatively large errors in the angle that you're actually producing. I tested it all the way up to 16 and it worked close enough. So be sure to check out last week's video where I made the threaded knobs that I actually used in this jig. And also be sure to come back next week for a project using this jig. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.